3 American destroyers entered the strait. The Iranian guards did not know what was waiting for them. For 68 days, those guards had been losing. Their supreme leader was killed in the opening hours of the war. Their ports were under blockade. Their tankers were being seized one by one. And on the 7th of May, 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers crossed into their waters at full transit speed. What happened next was not a battle. It was a measurement. What this engagement measured, and what it exposed about a doctrine the Revolutionary Guards had spent 40 years building, is the story that almost nobody told correctly. To understand what happened in the Strait that night, you have to start with what was already over by the time those destroyers got there. The war began on the 28th of February, when US and Israeli airstrikes opened with the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The Iranian state lost its head of state in the first hours. The Strait of Hormuz closed within days. By the 8th of April, a formal ceasefire was in place. By the 13th, the US Navy had begun a blockade of every Iranian port that mattered. 3 carrier strike groups were already in the region: the Lincoln, the Ford, and a third group that had arrived in early May. Roughly 22,000 American personnel, more than 200 aircraft, distributed across decks at sea and bases on land. Then, on the 4th of May, President Trump announced Operation Project Freedom, an escort mission to move stranded commercial ships out of the Gulf. 2 ships transited. The operation was paused 48 hours later, and then on the 7th of May, during that pause, 3 destroyers entered the strait anyway. That last detail is the one most coverage skipped. The destroyers were not escorting commercial traffic that night. They were transiting alone, through a corridor 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, against an adversary that had spent 40 years preparing for exactly this scenario. The Revolutionary Guards saw 3 of America's most expensive surface combatants moving into the only stretch of water where Iranian asymmetric doctrine has ever made sense. And the Guards made a decision. They opened the doors. For 4 decades, the IRGC Navy has built what its own commanders call missile cities. Tunnel networks carved into the salt domes and sedimentary rock beneath Qeshm Island and the coast around Bandar Abbas. The geology was the point. Salt is workable, self-sealing under pressure, naturally ventilated. The sedimentary layers above provide overhead protection rated against 5,000-pound bunker busters. Inside those tunnels, anti-ship cruise missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, naval mines, and hundreds of small, fast attack craft the Guards call Red Wasps. The whole doctrine, what military analysts call distributed lethality, depended on one principle: stay underground. Force the adversary to spend a $4 million interceptor on every $1 million weapon you fire. Lose every individual exchange. Win the economics. But there is one condition for that doctrine to work. The weapons have to come out. A missile in a tunnel cannot sink a ship. A fast attack boat in a cavern cannot ram a destroyer. The moment those doors open is the moment the entire underground arsenal becomes visible to every surveillance asset in the American inventory. And the American inventory in the region on the 7th of May was unprecedented. Geostationary infrared satellites watching for missile plumes, radar imaging satellites cutting through cloud cover, electro-optical sensors at high resolution, signals intelligence platforms collecting every radar emission from every fire control system the Guards activated. The Aegis destroyers themselves, with phased array radars that can track hundreds of separate threats simultaneously. And aerial refueling aircraft already in the air over Israel and Jordan, which is the leading indicator nobody outside the trade publications ever explains. When 5 KC-135 tankers launch from the UAE before sunset, strike packages are about to fly. That much aerial refueling capacity is not maintenance. It is preparation. Here is what the Guards walked into. The Aegis Combat System is not a missile. It is a decision architecture. Its radar, the Spy-1D on older Burke destroyers, the far more sensitive Spy-6 on the newest, continuously scans every direction, building a 3-dimensional picture of the air and sea around the ship. Its command and decision system ingests data not just from the ship's own sensors, but from every networked Aegis ship within hundreds of miles, from carrier-based airborne early warning aircraft, from satellites, from ground stations. It classifies every contact, ranks every threat, and assigns each one to the appropriate interceptor in milliseconds. The weapon control system then matches the threat to the weapon, an SM-3 for an exo-atmospheric ballistic intercept, an SM-6 for terminal phase, an evolved Sea Sparrow for inbound cruise missiles, the rolling airframe missile for short-range threats, and Phalanx for anything that closes inside the inner ring, the Mark 41. Vertical launching system fires from cells built into the deck. A single Arleigh Burke carries roughly 96 cells. 3 destroyers together carry close to 300. That is what was waiting for the swarm. The Guards launched what their doctrine demands: kamikaze drone formations, anti-ship cruise missiles, the Nor, the Gator, the older Silkworm derivatives, short-range ballistic missiles, and the centerpiece of the Hadar 110, an Iranian-built fast attack craft unveiled in Bandar Abbas in February of 2025, claimed to reach 110 knots, armed with cruise missiles designed specifically to close the detection-to-engagement window before any defensive system could react. The attack hit 0 American vessels. The drones were intercepted in the air. The missiles were knocked down before they reached the destroyers. The fast attack boats were destroyed before they closed within weapons range. 6 small boats sunk, confirmed by US Central Command. The result? 0 damage. The cost? Every weapon the Guards launched, and every position those weapons came from. Because the second half of the plan started the moment the doors opened. US satellites had been watching every launch point in real time. The Aegis ships were not just defending themselves, they were correlating every emission, every plume signature, every radar return with geolocation data feeding directly into the CENTCOM target queue. The doctrine of distributed lethality requires that the cheap, hidden weapons stay cheap and hidden. The moment they were used, they became expensive, because their launch positions were now marked on a map at Tampa, ready for the response. Iran's Revolutionary Guard had broken its own first rule. The American counterstrike started within the hour. Bandar Abbas, the main IRGC naval base, hit. Qeshm Island, the symbolic heart of the missile cities, hit. Sirik and Bandar Kamir, the secondary launch positions, hit. 40 years of underground investment, the largest construction project in the history of the Iranian armed forces, partially exposed in the time it took to launch one coordinated attack against 3 transiting destroyers. And this is where the story most people heard breaks down. Because while CENTCOM was striking Iranian targets, 2 American allies were doing something the Iranian state has been waiting for years to see. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait temporarily restricted US access to bases on their soil. The Gulf Coalition, which had publicly condemned Iran days earlier, did not stay silent, but it also did not stay still. The shipping industry response was sharper. Lloyd's List reported that ship owners and insurers had received no clarity, no credible protection, no reason to resume transits. Maersk had moved 1 vessel out under escort. Hapag-Lloyd had 4 still trapped. The International Maritime Organization stated, on the record, that naval escorts were not a sustainable solution. 1,600 ships remained at anchor in the Persian Gulf. 23,000 civilians from 87 countries remained stranded aboard them. Project Freedom moved 2 ships out before it was paused. The version of this story almost every video tells you is that the Americans set a trap and the Iranians fell for it. The fuller version is more uncomfortable. The Americans achieved a clean tactical defensive victory. They exposed weapons that had been hidden for decades. They struck targets that had been previously untouchable. And they did all of this while their own escort operation was paused. Their commercial backers were refusing to move. Their Gulf allies were sending pointed signals through base access. And their proposed solution to the world's most important shipping choke point had moved 2 ships in 48 hours. The Revolutionary Guards lost the engagement. The US Navy won it, and the strait remained closed. This is what makes the 7th of May worth understanding properly. Because there is a name for what happened that night that is older than any of the doctrines involved. In 1987, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States Navy began escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the same waters. The operation was called Earnest Will. It ran for 14 months. It culminated in April 1988, when an Iranian mine struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and the US response, Operation Praying Mantis, sank or disabled half the operational Iranian fleet in a single day. It was the largest US Navy surface engagement since the Second World War. The parallels to the present are not subtle. A US escort mission in the Strait, a confrontation with Iranian asymmetric forces, a defensive victory that exposed every weakness of the Iranian approach. What happened after Ernest Will is the part worth remembering. The mines kept appearing, the shipping kept hesitating, the insurance premiums kept rising, and the Strait did not return to normal commercial operations until the broader Iran-Iraq war itself ended a year later. The tactical engagement and the strategic outcome were on different clocks. The 7th of May was a tactical engagement. The Strait runs on a different clock. The Aegis system did what it was designed to do. The Revolutionary Guards did what their doctrine demanded. The Americans demonstrated for the first time in a real combat exchange against the full Iranian asymmetric playbook that a properly networked defensive layer can absorb a coordinated swarm without taking a hit. That is a meaningful military fact. It will be studied. It will reshape doctrine in capitals where naval engagements are gamed out for the next decade. But the political clock is still moving on its own schedule. Saudi Arabia closed base access for 6 hours. The shipping industry is not transiting. The blockade continues. The ceasefire holds technically even as ships fire at each other inside the strait it was meant to quiet. And the Iranian regime, leaderless since February, governed now by figures whose authority is questioned in every major capital, has lost a tactical engagement without losing what it actually needed to keep. The strait is still closed to anyone who does not have American escorts. Every ship that does not move costs the global economy roughly $1 billion a day. That clock has not stopped since the 28th of February. The Aegis system answers to physics and software. The Strait answers to insurance brokers, tanker captains, and the algorithms that price war risk by the voyage. Those two systems do not share a clock. A doctrine was tested on the night of the 7th of May. It failed. But the failure of a doctrine is not the same as the closing of a crisis, and the people sitting at anchor in the Gulf, burning fuel and waiting for someone to tell them it is safe to move, are not measuring time by the success of an Aegis intercept. They are measuring time by a different clock entirely, and that clock is still running.